Just a little bit of housekeeping and introductions as we get going. I'm Julie Bailey. I'm the Director of Corporate Engagement at BCS. And we have my colleague Jenna, who's online. She's going to be managing the chat. So if you want to put anything in the chat, Jenna will manage that and we can keep some time at the end for some questions. I'm happy for people to open mics and put cameras on and present their questions. That would be great if you would like to do that. If you don't, Jenna will pick up on the chat and we'll go from there. The panel discussion should be around 40 minutes, would have been 45, but I think we've taken a little bit long to come in. And we will do a quick introduction actually of the panel. So I'll come to you if that's okay first. Perhaps if you can just give us a 30-second introduction. Louise, if we can start with you.
Yes, certainly. Louise Voice here. I'm the Data Protection Officer and Information Governance Lead for both South Wales Police and Gwent Police, dealing with all sorts of things that fall within data protection, touching on security aspects, looking at all the wild and wonderful different types of processing and systems in policing, and involved in lots of exciting forward-looking things like facial recognition, and really pleased to be here.
Thanks, Louise. Luke, can we come to you next, please?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Hello, everybody. My name is Luke Webber. I am a Deloitte cyber partner. I've been working in cyber and tech and digital transformation for around about 25 years now, primarily with large HMG government and public sector departments. But latterly, that's meant a lot of engagement with their supply chain too, so across a wide array of industries and businesses.
Thank you very much. And Johnny?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Johnny Samu, I'm the Director of Digital Services at Welsh Ambulance Service. Apologies for the 5-minute delay. That's my fault, putting our very resilient and secure systems to the test this morning. Been with Welsh Ambulance for a couple of years and then Northwest Ambulance prior to that. And then I was in private sector for some time. So yeah, afternoon all.
Thank you. So just a little bit of recap on today's webinar. So this is all about strengthening digital resistance. This is the second of a series of webinars we're doing around the BCS Wales Hub. So today's topic, I think, is obviously concerning a number of senior digital leaders and hopefully some of their CEOs as well, because it needs to sort of transcend up. There's a real increasing reliance on digital technology, particularly when organisations are grappling as well with AI and the impact that that's making and the security risks, I guess, and things that sort of come around off the back of that. The assurance of trust is essential, I think, for executive boards and stakeholders and customers to sort of understand that that is there. And knowing that services are resilient, but most importantly, there's that level of mitigation against failure, I suppose, as much as anything, that is tried and tested and stood up when it needs to be. So the 4 themes we're going to talk about today is that impact to risk, building a more resilient infrastructure, strategies around risk mitigation, and the importance of leadership and education. And maybe it should be the other way around. That one perhaps should be at the top, but we'll get to that and we'll certainly give it some time. So Johnny, I think I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. So the impact to risk. The ambulance service provides a vital life-saving response. Stakes are high. What is the primary risk associated with your digital infrastructure? And perhaps a sort of a second element of that as well is does that impact your ability to deliver a quality service? So sort of, basing that as a theme.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Great question. I guess the first thing I just want to talk on is just the context in which we operate in the ambulance service. So digital underpins quite a lot, whether that be from 999 call handling through to how we dispatch, through to how we keep, manage and use clinical records. So when we think about the cost of this going wrong, with my old private sector hat on, it would have been financial a lot of the time. I guess the cost for us is life, and it's quite a cost to pay when we get it wrong. So some of the biggest risks that we've got, just to answer the first part, is unplanned downtime, whether that be from cyber attacks, could be system failures, third-party outages. And as you'll know, the NHS is well connected with lots of third parties. So we have quite a large supply chain. Now, a drop call in any of our systems, whether it be our patient record, it has a direct impact to that emergency response for people in their time of need. And when you think about the impact to service quality, that impacts confidence, it impacts clinical accuracy, and it impacts the care continuity that we apply. So you think about, we have a great deal of interoperability within the ambulance service across various legacy systems, various systems within the broader health system. So when one of those links fails, we have a ripple effect or a blast radius, as I refer to it, and that then compromises the entire chain, the entire system. So in terms of some of the specific challenges that we have against both of those, affecting both of those points, one of the things that we have is, as we're building up these interoperability pieces or new systems, we're trying to compartmentalize that risk. So we're having, layered backups in there. We're trying to reduce single points of failure where we can in terms of critical systems. Now, and complementary to that, one of the other issues we have is around what I label as shadow IT. So this is areas that are developing or procuring or creating their own systems without the formal support of the digital team. Now, that's a desire to move quickly, which is great, but actually some of that uncontrolled risk that is introduced in those unsanctioned ways is quite dangerous to that ecosystem. And lastly, culture. Culture is a big part for us. Having the confidence to use digital, to govern it, the awareness of where systems go wrong is something that we've really tried to focus on. But I guess in essence for us, resilience isn't a luxury. It's not a nice to have. It's absolutely non-negotiable.
Mm. Yeah, and it has to be, doesn't it? You can't afford that downtime. It
Absolutely.
impacts too greatly. Louise, just coming to you next. Transformation is constant, isn't it? Organizations looking at ways they can be more impactful through technology, and working at pace can be difficult. What's the impact of pace on governance? You spend your world inside governance, and it's a really difficult place to be. What's the impact of the pace on that, and what are you finding when it's coming to protecting that infrastructure?
Well, I think it's fair to say that pace and governance, there's a healthy tension between the two, because obviously we've got operational delivery. And I think it's, given all the discussions on the upcoming budget and cuts that we need to look at in policing and across the board in the emergency services, where we can find efficiencies, and efficiencies appear to be coming from, these days, technology. So there is a need for technology to be rolled out really quickly, and everything is based around that, and whether or not our infrastructure can withstand it, whether or not our people have got the right skills to be able to use it. But what we find from my perspective, from the governance perspective, is that doing something quickly doesn't necessarily make the whole thing quicker. So a faster deployment may cause delays because the risks haven't been assessed. We're not exactly clear about the entire end-to-end process and things like that. It does allow for things that Johnny's just mentioned, such as shadow IT. It doesn't allow us to really take into account whether or not that system is interoperable with other systems and how they could be used from a strategic point of view. So are we actually getting all the efficiencies and everything that we need across the entire force, and for working with partners that we could otherwise realise, because things are looked at in silos. What we've also got to look at is, we may be bringing something in, but is it giving us a sufficient quality of data? Because, as Johnny said, what we're dealing with, we're not just dealing with the information, we're dealing with people's lives. So we need to get it right, and we need to do all those assessments and know exactly what we're dealing with, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to a rapid deployment of things. And given the technologies that we are dealing with, you've already mentioned artificial intelligence. There are so many unknowns that we have to take some time and take a breath to understand it as much as we can, and take into account that forward look about the developments that are occurring, that we don't even know what the impacts or the risks are going to be of that. So yeah, I would say that for me, pace, if we slowed it down a little bit, then we save time in the long run. And we also save money, resource, and all of those things. So yeah, we want to do it quickly, but we want to do it right, and we only want to do it once.
And I suppose that leads into it, doesn't it? It's all about aligning things to a strategy. So if you've got that, if the strategy's there, then you know the governance and it comes in around it. But often we're having to do things outside of that, and I suppose that points that quite clearly back to that, doesn't it?
And I think with national strategies, they have to be flexible. They have to be quite loose. So it's bringing that into the organisation, individual organisations. I always thought that the police were the police, but coming into policing, each force is its own separate entity, and it has to build those strategies into practical ways of deploying things that are secure within that police force as well. So trying to tie that down. And of course, governance isn't the most exciting part of it. Somebody'd rather have the shiny, brand new, exciting little toy to play with. But yeah, we've got to make sure that the boring stuff, I find it quite exciting personally, but that is all considered in the first place, so that that shiny toy can actually work properly and to the best of its ability.
Thank you. So Luke, as a professional services company, you're clearly advising, obviously, on strategy an awful lot. How are you advising firms on the frailty of supply chain resistance? Because that's clearly something that we're seeing a lot of. We're seeing things in the press. I mean, poor old Marks and Spencers and Co-op have been impacted recently. What's the emerging themes? What are you seeing?
Incomplete knowledge, I think, Julie, is is the key thing, I think. So, I mean, it's very much building on the answers that Johnny and Louise gave to slightly different questions, but it's all based on the comprehensiveness of your understanding of your supply chain, and that includes your own teams, your internal structure, your shadow IT, the services that you procure, the stuff that you buy from the big hyperscalers. The list could go on and on and on and on. And I think one of the key challenges that I'm seeing with my client set in particular is no one has a good handle on what that looks like. And as a consequence, there are unknown risks throughout that supply chain. I think that the biggest theme that's emerging at the moment is how do you build coherence from IT through to digital, through to procurement and contracts? And how do you make sure that the teams who are procuring the services ordinarily push quite quickly by program? So is it me or have I got some
We've got a
weird
bit of,
going on, I
I
think?
think we've got a bit of echo somewhere. I'm just checking. Just maybe flip on and off with the microphone and see if it is you.
I think, Louise, I think you might be off. Is that any better?
That is, yes. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Yeah, so I think, there's the two themes are incomplete knowledge. So, organizations, departments don't have a comprehensive view of their supply chain, internal and external, and coherence between procurement, commercial contracts, and the teams who are pushing to deliver and then operate and run those services. Where we have seen that work well is fundamentally where there's been a big educational piece with procurement and contracting teams to say these things mean this is why it's important.
Mm,
These are kind of the must-haves in our contract. These are some of the gives in our contract based on cost. But ostensibly, we need to be sure that our supply chain is meeting regulatory requirements, is meeting contracted requirements, and that we will then manage those for the duration of the contract. And I can't comment with any detail on the highly publicized M&S challenges, for example, but it's looking more and more like that was a supply chain issue and potentially a contractual issue too.
mm.
So for me, it's that, that's really, really key.
Is there an element of people just being feeling assured because they've bought from a large supplier? I bought SAP, so therefore I'm fine because they're taking that responsibility.
100%, and a lack of understanding about what you get from a SAP or a Salesforce or multiple other providers of services like that, and what the consumer, the user is still ostensibly responsible for. And I think there's a big assumption that I bought SaaS, I'm good, when actually there's a huge amount of work that needs to go on assuring the SaaS and then making sure what you build and deploy is secure too.
What can organisations ask for that sort of level of assurance? What can they look for? What sort of validation can they expect from those providers?
Yeah, I mean, I think Johnny's probably better placed to answer this question because I imagine he's in the thick of it constantly. But there are a whole raft of regulatory certifications. There's SOC certifications. Most of these providers will share their penetration test outputs for the services that they've got. They'll have industry certifications. Some will have Cyber Essentials Plus in a
Mm,
UK public sector context, for example, and ISO certifications. It's all of that stuff. And then I think organizations need to also ask some pretty specific questions based on the context within which they operate and force those providers to provide the evidence that satisfies them on that basis. And I think building a little bit on Louise's point, actually, there's a lot of inconsistency there. So some organizations will just go with what the website says, and others will pull out a whole assurance sheet and expect providers, suppliers to complete that, and neither of which is working particularly well at the moment, I don't think, because one is either assuming risk mitigation is there without evidence, and the other is slowing down tech and digital transformation to a snail's pace almost because they're populating Excel spreadsheets that don't actually help you quantify or qualify risk.
mm. Johnny, do you have anything to add into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the people bit's really important, isn't it? The supply chain will always be the supply chain, and I think you've got to work with them, certainly from us, in partnership. It can't be that you just go off and procure something or get something or throw some kit at something and expect it just to be resilient and expect it to work. I think you have to have the right partners through the supply chain, and I think you also need to have the right culture within the organization as well. The digital resilience isn't a digital issue, it's an organizational issue. And I think the minute that the organization understands that, the minute you have everybody working with you on resilience rather than seeing it as a sort of tick box or another accreditation that we need to have. So I think it needs to have that people join up. And I think, Luke, you hit the nail on the head there. I think there's that the culture bit with that is so strong. It's so important to get that right.
Mm. Johnny, just actually coming to you about building that more resilient infrastructure. So what initiatives are strengthening resilience within, the ambulance service in Wales? What are you doing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think certainly in Wales, we've tried to take a bit of a systemic approach to resilience. So it's not just the technologies I mentioned, it's around building the right culture, having the right clinical engagement, and having the right digital alignment. So what I mean by that is actually working with the team. So there isn't this need for a shadow IT. Actually, we can work together on curating and co-designing systems so that's tackled correctly. I guess we've put a lot of effort into empowering people. So I think this for me is the real hack with this. So I mean, a big reflection is having a digital voice at the board is so important. I've worked in organizations where we have this and where we don't, and the difference is stark. It really, really does help. I think creating a culture where people feel psychologically safe to speak up where digital isn't right, and that that's not been hidden elsewhere, has been really powerful for us. So we're sharing a problem and we're building the right technology solution around that. And I guess having thinking back to the board, actually running sessions with your exec directors, non-exec directors, so we share the understanding around continuity planning, around cyber incidents, actually just making sense of what do we mean by that, taking the tech jargon out of it and making this something real that the board can hold, I think is really powerful. And I think you'll find the level of critique, the level of questionings that you get back is far more powerful. So then in turn, it pushes the digital service to be sharper as well. For me, the other thing, and Luke started to touch on this with the innovation bit, innovation is happening at pace now, a significant pace, and far more than most digital teams can keep up with. So what we've tried to do here at Welsh Ambulance is create a safe space for that innovation so people can try, they can fail, but actually learn from those failures in a safe space. So AI, I think it's in every conversation going at the minute. We're trying to create a space where people can really explore this, but without impacting anything in terms of a logistics chain or any sort of resilience issues through not being agile. So for me, one of the things I share with my teams is resilience for us isn't a product. It's not something you grab. It's a posture. So for us, we need to be ready, and the system that we work in needs to flex with that innovation because it's moving at pace, whether we like it or not.
That's a really interesting. I like that posture because it should be, shouldn't it? It should be inherent in everything you're looking at. Louise, like the ambulance service, the police have got a vital role in maintaining an interrupted operation. How do you ensure best practice for designing and maintaining that resilient service?
I think that there are certainly principles out there, whether or not it's from legislation or standards, that can provide you with a sort of blueprint, if you like, for being able to have that sort of resilient approach. I mean, in policing, we're very lucky in terms of the National Police Chiefs Council will put out the overarching flexible strategy. We've got the National Digital Strategy, and that sort of acts like a sort of North Star, if you like, and we can sort of take direction from that as to where we go. For me, I deal with information risk and data protection. So I look towards things like data protection impact assessments. And I always see people having, a bit of a heavy sigh when I suggest that they need to complete one. But when I tell them about the value of it, so you're thinking through what you want to do. You're building in privacy by design and default, security by design, and then you're risk assessing it. And the way that we've designed ours, it's so that you've got the data protection governance aspect, but you've also got the information security aspect. And I think, what comes out of this is that resilience isn't just owned by IT or by digital. Everybody has got a different perspective that needs to feed into that, and it needs to be an ongoing risk assessment as well. It's not a tick box exercise. You've done it once. It needs to go throughout the implementation and operation of whatever system you're putting in. We've already mentioned AI and how that's developing at pace. So we've got to keep up with those things. We've got to keep assessing it and make sure that we know what we want from it. But in terms of resilience, particularly for the police as well, the critical part of that is identifying and prioritising what our critical systems are, and that if we do need to react to something like a cyber attack or unplanned downtime, where do we need to focus our priorities and what do we need to do? And I think Johnny's already touched on things like, raising that at board level, utilising our risk registers to highlight these things and the governance boards, making sure that we've got incident response plans tested and ready so that everybody knows what to do. But it's anticipating those unknown risks and getting people to think outside the box, beyond the obvious, and even thinking about the different kinds of risk that may present itself, whether it's the physical, whether it's the cyber, whether it's, information, all these different things, take into account the water supplies, take into account the impact on your partners and things like that. So it's, it's really a huge undertaking, really. That's why it needs to be thought through properly, but get the right people around the table because everybody has got something to bring.
Okay, and it is definitely that you don't need it until you need it situation, isn't it? So I suspect the PR of it is a good time to be really hitting home at the moment the importance of governance
Yes.
around this stuff and strategy. I think it's
what I find is that it's a difficult message to push when you haven't got anything to demonstrate what can go wrong.
yes.
Obviously, we'd rather things didn't go wrong here. So, unfortunately for M&S, we would take that as a really good example of what can go wrong to be able to push that message forward and do things proactively instead of reactively.
Yeah, it makes an awful lot of sense. Luke, you clearly work with organisations to ensure they have that resilience by design. What factors are you asking them to consider when you're talking with organisations?
I think a lot of it Johnny and Louise have already covered, Julie. So it almost sounds like we've
Mm,
rehearsed this actually. I mean, and it sounds cliched and it sounds repetitive, but the prioritization piece is absolutely key. And I think, from a digital or IT perspective, those teams have been arguing for a long time. It's about system priority. Which systems do we need to bring up first? Which systems do we need to spend more on to protect? I think that kind of morphed into data equities. What are the data sets we need to protect more? What's the impact of a breach or a loss of some of this data? And that's now morphing again towards a service view, which is fantastic, but that brings inherent complexity because suddenly that means, as Louisa said, you need to think about everything, not just the IT anymore. And I think the key for me is that prioritization, but across all of the service lines or groups that comprise the organization. And by that, I mean it can't be an IT derived conversation. It can't be a digital derived conversation. The CISO can't drive this conversation either, neither can the DPO. It has to
mm,
be a CEO, COO, CFO conversation. Otherwise, everything else is just kind of you're scrambling around for pennies to spend on a unit of resilience, but you can't quantify that to the board. So next year you don't get the same pennies. So it's really, really hard to continue to do that. And I think the key for me, absolutely, and what we've seen in the large public sector departments in particular, is it doesn't really land until either it's happened or ideally you've compelled them to commit to an exercise
mm,
because it makes it very, very real. And the implications of every decision that's been made, every funding decision that's been made, every audit and risk committee, and the logging of all of those actions and risks suddenly becomes really, really real. When there's a kind of ICO aspect to it, and someone's saying, "Can you just explain to me why you did that thing on that date? Because now we're dealing with this." And suddenly it just tends to galvanize boards, I think. So I
mm,
think kind of, yeah, two things, the move towards a service-oriented architecture. I mean, it's a little bit past that now, but has meant that everybody needs to understand this and everybody needs to play a part in delivering resilience, the posture that Johnny described. And the sooner you can make it real for C-suite and board members, ideally by exercising and ideally not by an actual incident, the sooner you can galvanize an organization to start to step towards resilience.
mm. And that strategy again is vital. What's important to you as an organization? Is it your brand reputation? Is it your customer reputation? What is it? What's the thing at the top? It's a very important bit for that board to understand the impact of, for sure. Johnny, with that business continuity in mind, what measures are in place for the Welsh Ambulance Service? What are you doing?
Yeah, it's a good question again. I think for us, that continuity piece is 24/7, right? So it's not something we have on a shelf. And kind of back to Louise's point earlier, there can't be like a fire drill you just run once a year and expect it just to work. So we've really put a lot of time and effort into the cultural piece. But before I get onto that, the practical stuff that we've done that's worked quite well, running live desktop exercises throughout the different layers within the organization has been really useful. So right from board through to C-suite, right through to your different layers of management within the team. So people really understand one, where your system and physical system pressures are, but also how would people respond under those pressures? How would it feel? What would you need to do? So you start to build, I talked about posture, you almost build a muscle memory with some of this. And I guess the important message we've used there is actually this isn't just about tech teams being comfortable with this. There's lots that people need to learn when things go wrong. The other thing we've done practically is we've everything we build in terms of technology, we design to fail gracefully. So it's the old fail to prepare, prepare to fail cliche, but it does work. You need to make sure that failure is inevitable, but it doesn't have to be catastrophic. So we've made sure we build that into the design process. And we've talked about shadow IT, and this is a real challenge for any digital team. Some of the things we've done here, though, we started to introduce mandatory digital asset registers. We started to have ownership checks, so we're having a look at information asset owners groups, how are they working together across the organisation. And then we start to have a look at digital stewards. So each of our directorates will have a digital steward who can essentially find those areas and connect us so we can help them. In terms of cultural levers, it's a bit strange. Anyone who knows me, I've talked about this a lot. There's a great book by Sam Conniff, Be More Pirate. I'd encourage you to have a read if you get a chance. But we've tried to adopt a Be More Pirate methodology with our culture in the ambulance service. So we've tried to empower the teams to actually break down some of the old rules, all these legacy, it's always been done this way. And actually, let's just go poking at some of that, because a lot of it is there to be broken. So this isn't about reckless rule breaking, but actually it's around breaking down things that have always been there, so you can really get into the nuts and bolts of how some of that unresilient stuff has been created. And we talked about board as well. So as I say, we've encouraged and created a safe space for the execs and non-execs to actually ask some of the silly questions, or what they deem silly, because they don't exist as far as we're concerned in digital. So we've really put a lot of effort into the language that we use in the boardroom, and actually making this quite accessible. Yeah, a range of things there, hopefully helpful. But I think it's a culture and a practical thing in terms of the approach for us.
So I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to drop right through to that leadership bit. So Johnny, sort of in following on with that theme slightly, public trust is obviously critical, and you're obviously doing an awful lot to ensure that the senior leadership are understanding the challenges. A, is that installing trust, do you think? And B, is that leadership driving some of that change as well?
Yeah, so another good question. I think it does. It comes back to that board level ownership for me. I think you do need somebody there who's got that voice at the board. That then siphons down through the organisation. And I think that's particularly powerful. Certainly in ambulance service for us, it's not just about the internal trust, it's that public trust piece. So what we've tried to do, and all our digital strategy centered on this, is making all of our services really accessible. So we're not just throwing technology at our staff or our patients, but actually we're working with them to develop and co-design those. The other thing that we've done is we've really taken seriously our public data stewardship. So I mean, I'm our organisation CIO, so that does help. But actually, for us, we take the way that we use data, the way we store that, really seriously, and we've embedded that into anything that we do. So we've got representation from our CIO, our Caldecott Guardian, and more importantly, our frontline voices as well. I think back to that speak up culture. This has helped us. People feel safe to question it. So that's building the trust. And as I say, for us, this trust piece isn't just a one and done. Kind of back to Louise's earlier point, we need to keep building on it. That trust is earned, and we're going to keep working on that. I think it's a evolutionary thing.
No, that makes an awful lot of sense as well. And there's a fear sometimes to push bad news up, isn't there? I think we see that particularly in the public sector organisations. Louise, obviously that role of leadership is vital in any organisation. Resilience planning, we've heard that right the way through. How does it change the importance of the DPO's role in an organisation when you're trying to protect it with the right sort of governance? Do you have any sort of mechanisms in place to actually help that within the police? How do you get that voice heard?
Well, for me, a lot of it's about demonstrating compliance and using that sort of risk-based approach so that it's easily explainable. Like we've said previously, we don't want to actually experience the pitfalls, but getting that balance of, we're willing to help you get it right, but we need to consider these things in order to do that. And it may not be, financially quite as you thought or as quick as you thought, but the longer term benefits, and trying to, I find that putting a monetary value on things is a really good lever, because that's what people running businesses understand. In terms of the impacts on individuals, obviously, we don't want to put anybody in danger because a resilience may fail. But I think communication, education, and using, I use examples from Netflix, and that may seem quite, lowbrow, but it's what people understand. It's what people are interested in. I was watching Zero Day yesterday, and, major cyber attack, how do you respond to it? What can you learn from that? What can you learn from data incidents? As we've said with M&S, what can we learn from that? What does it show us? And you building all of that in, that creates that understanding at that sort of C-suite level. But I think as well, for a DPO, I find sometimes it may be that my voice isn't enough. So I need other departments to also be on the same page as me, to have that reinforcement. So it's not just me saying it, everybody else understands it and they're all on board. So to get that, overarching buy-in, I think really does influence leaders. But of course, there's that dotted line direct to the CIO, so that they understand, and having the network of information asset owners who are frequently considering the risks with prompts from, my area, for example, about things that they wouldn't have thought of. And that's then highlighting what is going on in the overarching business to the leadership. And we've got governance boards and things like that where we're able to air that kind of thing as well and present it in a way that is visually acceptable and understandable to the C-suite, and then get the buy-in that way.
Okay, thank you. Luke, let's just talk about culture for a minute. So how is culture changing around security and resilience within the organizations you're working with? Are you seeing a shift in appetite to be more aware of it? Are we seeing a shift generally, do you think?
Very mixed. In truth, Jews, it's very, very mixed. And I think, unfortunately, the culture or attitude is shifting quite quickly in organizations that have either had an ICO reprimand or have experienced an issue. And those that haven't for a while, it kind of, back to Louise's point, the constant reminding, the fact that it has to be an embedded process that is part of the DNA of an organization is so important, because every pound spent on resilience is very, very hard to quantify in an ROI term. It really, really is. And it's not too dissimilar actually to a lot of the challenge that fraud and error is facing at the moment in public sector and private sector, is that every pound spent looking for fraud, if you don't find it and you aren't recovering the funds or preventing the fraud, it's really, really hard to quantify. So I think what's happening at the moment is culture is changing in organizations that have experienced an incident or an ICO reprimand, so they're kind of the sword, if you like, but is also changing to an extent because customers and citizens are becoming more knowledgeable and expect more. So back to, I think it was the question you asked to Johnny in terms of trust. That is becoming more of a buying requirement now from consumers. It's becoming a vocal citizen requirement where somebody will ask their MP, what is HMRC doing about their data and how are they protecting it? I think to an extent, that's furthered by special category citizen records as well and special category PII. People are asking more and more about how that's being protected. And it's becoming a buying requirement, a demand prompt, if you like. So I don't necessarily think that's changing the culture in organizations necessarily, but it is changing the things that they need to focus on to be credible in whatever market they're operating in or whatever public sector space they're serving. So that's really important. Um, I still don't think it's going anywhere near far enough, though. Back to my point, I still think there's a lot more to do.
So I suppose there's another side to that question, really. There is a need to ensure alignment between IT strategy and business goals. That I think we're hearing right the way through. If that's not happening, nothing works. You haven't got the governance in place. You don't know where you're going. You're spending money in a direction you might not need to spend it, or you perhaps shouldn't. So how does a leader trust the information they're receiving to make those decisions? How do they know it's truly necessary and not just a costly recommendation from their CIO, I want to spend more money on kit? How do they know? That must be difficult.
Yeah, extremely, because I will advise a client and say your spend on cybersecurity, for example, is way below the context of the organization and the risk that you're facing. The client will normally turn back around to me and go, that's all well and good, but when I present that to the CFOs and CEO, they'll turn around and go, well, give me the tangible quantifiables that justify that. And it's hard, right? Because cyber risk isn't necessarily very quantifiable. And I think this is one of the key themes actually that I was really keen to express today, is that dashboarding and from a cyber risk perspective is one aspect to it, but it's the curiosity, it's the ambiguity, which is why this is still such a specialist, unique niche area. You can't replace genuine cybersecurity competence and resilience and digital resilience by buying a product, dashboarding, and setting up some alerts, because the malicious actors aren't operating like that. They don't worry about that. They're thinking about all sorts of people, construct, culture, third-party relationships, mechanisms of attacking the organization. And I'll use that as the example. And I think what that means is the people that we deploy and the capability that we build has to be equally as curious. Of course, use all of those tools. Of course, use all of those products. AI, of course, will feed into that. And I have to say that, Johnny, I'm legally bound to include it in the list of things that will be important. But it's still fundamentally, ostensibly fueled by people who are super curious, who are constantly skilled, who are looking at the best ways of protecting the organization. Back to the question that you've asked, why I think that's important is because if you're the chief of that org, you need to be curious. You need to ask the stupid questions because 9 times out of 10, you won't get the answer because the question was never that stupid in the first place. And I think that's the best way to do that. And we have this conversation with boards, with CDIOs and CIOs all of the time. Just because you're in that position doesn't mean your education stops. So keep learning, keep developing your competence and skill, because then you can genuinely challenge the people who are coming to you saying, I need this for this, or I need that for that.
So this segues perfectly, I think, into the last question, which I want all your opinion on, really. So where does the accountability for this sit? Who wants to go with that? Where does it sit? Because, I think we've talked a lot about boards, we've talked a lot about the governance piece, we've talked a lot about the impact and the education. But ultimately, there's somebody culpable, in my opinion, for what's coming down the line. And I'm really keen to just hear your thoughts. Johnny, do you want to come to you?
Yeah, is it too cliche to say it's everyone's issue? A little. I think digital hold technical accountability. They always will. They definitely should. So, but I think true service resilience, whether that be a private or a public sector organisation, sits across the entire organisation. I think the accountability needs to be shared but defined. So what we've done here at Welsh Ambulance is we're pretty clear in a crisis or a moment of outage who does what, right from exec right down to frontline staff. And I think we exercise that. So there's the flexibility, there's the confidence that if something goes wrong, we know what we're doing. But yeah, I think it's a shared thing.
Okay. Louise?
Yeah, I've got to agree with Johnny there. I mean, ultimately for us, it's going to be the chief constable. The finger's going to be pointed at him. However, to get the right information to him, for him to be able to make the right decisions, it's got to be a cross-team effort because we've all got different elements that we need to contribute to getting that informed decision made. So yeah, it's working in partnership with all the different sort of specialisms to create that full explanation of what the risk is.
The boss,
Yeah.
the perm sec, the CEO, whoever that is. I mean, I completely agree that the quantification and the way that you manage or build digital resilience is absolutely a group thing. I think what I see is that when it's everyone, it's kind of no one. And that's the kind of the counter to that, I think. And of course, we want it to be embedded in everyone's role and job description and everything they think about, but then it kind of doesn't terminate anywhere. So I think unequivocally it's the boss, be that the perm sec, the CEO, whoever is the leader of that particular organization in private and public sector.
Using a
Oh, it's
football analogy, when the team has failed, who goes? And I suppose I agree, everybody's responsible to get to that point, but ultimately I think the culpability sort of does sit a little bit at the top, and I think we'll see more of that, particularly as more things come through in the way we're seeing recently. I think we're going to see a lot more, and I think the CEOs need to be really wise to this now. They can't just afford to push it down and say technical issue. It's a CIO, either the CIO is on the board and influencing or influencing that board. So I think that's a really good place to sort of draw a line. We've got some time for some questions, so I'll come to Jenna in a minute. But just before I do that, I really want to thank our panel, who have been tremendous and put time into this, and we do really appreciate that. So thank you very much. Your time today is most appreciated, and I'm hopeful that the audience will also agree that was very useful. So thank you. We'll come to some questions. If anybody would like to ask a question that isn't in the chat, please feel free to raise a hand and come off camera, and we'll come to you. So any hands going up, we'll go that way first. Jenna, I know we've got a few questions in the chat, so while people are deciding whether they're wanting to raise a hand,
Yeah, we
come
have.
to you.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions and a couple of thanks. So this question was put in by Paul. So what strategies or frameworks do you use to assess and manage third-party risk, particularly in relation to data security and service continuity?
Anybody like to take an offer on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you an ambulance NHS view on this. There's a couple of things. We've got data security protection toolkits we follow. We have very strict procurement frameworks that we operate in within the NHS, so we can ensure right up front that suppliers are actually meeting some of those compliance standards. I guess in terms of the partnership piece I talked about earlier, what we try and do is embed really strong contractual clauses, so we're able to not just monitor our performance against governance safeguarding, but actually we've got some real clarity around ownership, who does what, and expectation. And I guess the last point, sort of Luke touched on this earlier, was the monitoring. So we make sure we regularly monitor that, and not just a tick box, how's that looking? The board are actively engaged here in terms of asking questions around performance of third parties. And again, I agree that there's an accountability piece there at the top, but we need to ask the right questions as well. And I think that's kind of how we manage it.
Thank you. Jenna?
Lovely, thank you. The second question that I have here was put in by Charles. So how do the C-level take a deeper sense of responsibility for digital resilience?
Yeah. So Luke, do you want to, or Louise, do you want to pick that one up?
I could do 30 seconds if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Funding, ostensibly. I think the reality of it is that there is a model that still exists across most organizations whereby once the service has gone live, that now sits with IT, including resolution and remediation of issues, be they cyber and or operational. I think where we have seen this work more successfully is when different members of the board plus their service groups or their service lines have to set aside funding to resolve those issues if they occur. So they have a joint financial responsibility for the continuation of the service. It is really, really key. And then just back to your point really quickly at the end, I suspect we'll see CEOs performance measurement, including a lot more of the resilience, outages, availability, obviously worded in a different way as part of their performance criteria for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially those organizations that focus on bonus, that have to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you. And the last question, Jenna?
They aren't questions, they're just thank you. So yeah, saying
Okay.
how relevant the conversation and the challenges are. And yeah, just excellent session from David.
Thank you very much.